This wasn't supposed to happen here, not in the richest country on earth, not in a nation that measures success in trillions and calls itself the land of opportunity. And yet, across America, survival has become the full-time job. People are working more, earning more on paper, and somehow falling further behind. Rent eats paychecks. Healthcare is avoided like a luxury. Groceries are rationed. Debt replaces income. This isn't a recession. It's not a temporary downturn. It's a quiet collapse happening in plain sight. And the most dangerous part isn't how bad it's gotten. It's how normal this has started to feel. Normal life didn't collapse all at once. It failed quietly, structurally, and then all at the same time. For decades, stability followed a predictable formula: work full-time, pay your bills, save a little, move forward. That formula no longer functions. What broke wasn't effort or motivation. What broke was the math. The cost of simply existing began rising faster than income in ways most people didn't immediately notice, until nothing worked anymore. Since 2020, consumer prices are up roughly 25%, but median wages did not rise anywhere close to that. Housing costs surged far beyond incomes, with national rents climbing 30 to 40% in just a few years. Mortgage rates more than doubled, pushing monthly payments up by $1,000 to $1,500 for the same home price. Healthcare premiums rose faster than inflation, with individual plans now regularly exceeding $1,200 to $1,800 per month. None of this happened gradually enough for people to adapt. It happened faster than budgets could adjust. This is the moment normal life broke, when fixed costs overtook income before life even began. When paychecks started arriving already spent. When earning more no longer created relief, only delayed stress. When survival expenses stopped being optional and started behaving like debt obligations. What makes this rupture so destabilizing is that it contradicts everything people were told. Higher education was supposed to protect you. Full-time employment was supposed to be enough. Professional jobs were supposed to provide insulation. Instead, stability became conditional. Miss one paycheck, get sick once, face one rent increase. The system no longer absorbs shocks, it amplifies them. This is not lifestyle inflation. This is structural compression. Essentials, housing, food, insurance, utilities, expanded until they crowded out everything else. Discretionary spending didn't disappear because people lost discipline. It disappeared because there was nothing left after survival. When groceries, rent, and healthcare absorb 70 to 80% of take-home pay, choice becomes an illusion. That's why this moment feels different from past downturns. In previous cycles, people tightened belts and waited. This time, there is no belt left to tighten. The margin is gone. The buffer is gone. The promise that effort guarantees progress is gone. And once that promise breaks, everything else follows. Because when normal life stops working, people don't immediately revolt. They adjust, they delay, they borrow, they accept less. That silent adaptation is what allows a broken system to keep functioning, right up until the consequences can no longer be hidden. This is the foundation of everything that comes next. Because when survival becomes expensive, work stops being enough. And when work stops being enough, the entire structure begins to strain under its own weight. Once the math broke, the trap snapped shut. When income stopped covering essentials, life didn't just become harder. It became structurally constrained. Housing, food, and healthcare stopped behaving like normal expenses and started acting like fixed tolls. You pay them first, or you don't function at all. Everything else comes second, if anything is left. Housing is the anchor weight. National median rents now sit around $2,000 a month, but in many metros, they push $2,500 to $3,000 without offering more space, quality, or stability. Homeownership didn't become harder because people lost discipline. It became unreachable because monthly payments exploded. A house that once carried a $1,600 payment now demands $2,800 to $3,200 at today's rates. The asset didn't change. The income didn't double. The cost did. Food followed the same path. Grocery prices rose roughly 25 to 30% since 2020, but food is not discretionary. People can't wait it out. When staples rise, the cut doesn't come from luxury. It comes from quantity, quality, and nutrition. That's how survival quietly degrades. Not through famine, but through constant compromise. Then there's healthcare, the most destabilizing cost because it punishes need itself. Employer plans regularly exceed $600 to $900 per month per person. Marketplace plans often land between $1,200 and $1,800 before deductibles. One emergency visit can erase months of savings. The rational response inside this system isn't treatment, it's avoidance. That's not healthcare. That's risk management under pressure. Here's where the trap closes. These costs don't flex when income drops. They don't pause during layoffs. They don't care about overtime or education. Housing, food, and insurance consume income first, automatically. When those three categories absorb 60 to 75% of take-home pay, budgeting stops being a tool and becomes a fantasy. This is why the earlier promise collapses here. Work may still produce income, but survival extracts it immediately. There is no runway, no buffer, no recovery window. Every month resets to zero. And once survival costs dominate the equation, behavior shifts permanently. Spending collapses, saving disappears, risk tolerance vanishes. People don't stop participating because they're irresponsible. They stop because the system leaves them no room to breathe. That's the survival cost trap. It doesn't just drain money, it drains mobility. Once survival costs take control, work is supposed to be the escape. That was the promise. It no longer works. Employment used to convert effort into stability. Today, it converts effort into maintenance. Paychecks arrive, disappear into fixed costs, and reset to zero before life even begins. That isn't a motivation problem. It's a system where labor has lost leverage. Productivity has risen more than 60% since the late 1970s, yet real wages barely moved. The gap didn't vanish, it was captured. Corporate profits hit record margins while labor's share of income shrank. The result is an economy where working more no longer means getting ahead, only falling behind more slowly. This is why hours keep expanding. Full-time is no longer sufficient. Overtime became normal. Second jobs became common. Third income streams stopped being ambition and started being defense. But stacking labor doesn't change the outcome when wages lag costs structurally. You can't outrun a system where income grows at 2 to 3%, while essentials compound at double that pace. Even professional employment lost its protective function. Degrees didn't fail because they lost value. They failed because the floor beneath them collapsed. Entry wages rose modestly, but requirements multiplied. Experience demands increased while training disappeared. Employers externalized risk, cutting benefits, shortening contracts, and shifting volatility onto workers. The job still exists. The security does not. What makes this stage dangerous is how invisible it feels at first. People assume they're doing something wrong. They work harder. They sacrifice time. They trade health for hours. But exhaustion doesn't fix a broken exchange rate between labor and life. A $65,000 salary sounds solid. After taxes, that's roughly $4,000 a month. Subtract rent, insurance, utilities, food, and transportation, and the remainder is often less than $500. That isn't upward mobility, that's endurance. This is the moment the psychological contract snaps. When work no longer builds, people stop planning. They stop saving. They stop risking. The economy doesn't just slow, it hollows out. Consumption collapses not because of fear, but because there's nothing left to allocate. And when labor fails as an escape mechanism, the system introduces a substitute, not relief, not reform. A placeholder that keeps everything functioning just long enough. That substitute is debt. When work stops creating escape, the system introduces a replacement to keep everything moving. That replacement is not higher wages or lower costs. It is debt. Debt becomes the bridge between income and survival when paychecks can no longer cover reality. It fills the gap quietly, month after month, allowing the illusion of normal life to continue. Groceries go on credit. Medical bills get delayed. Rent gaps are patched with plastic. Nothing is solved, but collapse is postponed. This is not accidental. Household debt in the United States now exceeds $17 trillion, with credit card balances alone surpassing $1.3 trillion. Interest rates near 20 to 30% are no longer reserved for emergencies. They are embedded into daily life. Debt isn't being used to get ahead. It's being used to stay functional. Here's the structural shift. Income used to pay for life directly. Now income services debt that paid for life earlier. That inversion is catastrophic over time. When interest compounds faster than wages, future labor is pre-sold at a discount. People are no longer working for progress. They are working to stabilize yesterday. Medical debt is the clearest example. Healthcare costs don't scale with income, timing, or readiness. A single emergency can generate $5,000 to $20,000 in bills overnight. Insurance doesn't eliminate this risk. It redistributes it through deductibles and exclusions. The rational response inside this system isn't care, it's delay. Health becomes a financial calculation, not a human need. Credit cards complete the loop. Minimum payments create the appearance of manageability while locking households into permanent extraction. A $10,000 balance at 24% APR can take over a decade to clear, even with consistent payments. That's not borrowing. That's slow confiscation of future income. This is where control enters the equation. Credit scores don't measure responsibility anymore. They measure compliance. Miss one payment, and housing access, transportation, insurance pricing, and even employment opportunities tighten instantly. Debt doesn't just cost money, it governs behavior. And notice what disappears in this phase. Savings, mobility, optionality. When cash flow is routed through lenders before reaching people, resilience collapses. Any disruption, job loss, illness, rent increase, pushes households from strained to insolvent with no buffer in between. This is why debt masks crisis rather than resolving it. It keeps demand alive artificially. It prevents immediate breakdown, but it also guarantees a harsher reckoning later. Because debt cannot replace income forever. Eventually, interest outruns labor entirely. When that happens, people don't just fall behind financially. They become invisible statistically. They earn too much to qualify for help, but too little to survive without borrowing. When debt becomes the mechanism holding daily life together, the official numbers are supposed to tell us how bad things really are. They don't. They hide it. The poverty line in the United States is not a measure of lived deprivation. It is a relic. It was built for a mid-20th century economy where housing was cheap, healthcare was limited in scope, and food consumed a predictable share of income. That framework no longer exists, but the measurement never evolved with reality. Today, the official poverty threshold for a family of four sits just above $32,000 a year. That figure suggests survival is possible on roughly $2,700 a month before taxes. In an economy where median rent alone often exceeds $2,000, the math collapses instantly. The number doesn't describe hardship. It describes near starvation. What's more dangerous is what this definition excludes. The poverty line ignores housing inflation, healthcare premiums, insurance deductibles, childcare, transportation, and debt servicing. It assumes costs that no longer exist and omits expenses that dominate modern life. The result is a statistical illusion where millions struggling to survive are officially classified as not poor. This is how functional poverty replaces visible poverty. People earn too much to qualify for assistance, yet far too little to meet basic obligations without borrowing. They are invisible to safety nets, invisible in headlines, and invisible in policy responses. But they are not rare. They are the backbone of the labor force. Independent analyses show that when real costs are accounted for, the income required to maintain basic stability for a family of four approaches $120,000 to $140,000 in many regions. That's not luxury. That's rent, food, insurance, utilities, transportation, and modest savings. Compare that to the official line, And the scale of misrepresentation becomes clear. This gap explains the contradiction people feel but can't articulate, why full-time workers feel broke, why professionals feel trapped, why entire generations feel like they're failing, despite doing everything they were told. The system tells them they're fine because the statistics say so. Their bank accounts say otherwise. And here's the critical connection. Debt fills the space created by this lie. Because if poverty were measured honestly, the crisis would be undeniable. Programs would have to expand, wages would have to rise, costs would have to fall. Instead, borrowing absorbs the pressure quietly while the official story insists everything is manageable. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's a structural convenience. By understating poverty, the system avoids accountability while pushing survival costs onto individuals through debt. The result is an economy where suffering is normalized, assistance is rationed, and collapse is postponed rather than addressed. When poverty is defined to hide reality, the next question becomes unavoidable. This didn't happen by accident. The erosion of the middle class was not sudden and it was not natural. It was engineered through a series of structural decisions that transferred risk downward while concentrating rewards at the top. The first break came when wage growth was disconnected from productivity. Since the early 1980s, output per worker surged, but real wages flattened. That missing value didn't disappear. It was redirected into profits, executive compensation, and asset prices. Labor kept producing more, but ownership captured the gains. That single shift changed the trajectory of household stability permanently. Next came financialization. Stock buybacks were legalized and normalized, allowing corporations to use profits not to raise wages or invest in workers, but to inflate share prices. Trillions of dollars flowed into equities instead of paychecks. The middle class lost income growth while being told to participate in markets to compensate. Then, retirement security was dismantled. Pensions, which pooled risk and guaranteed stability, were replaced by individual investment accounts. Responsibility shifted from institutions to workers without education, protection, or downside limits. Market volatility became a personal problem. Retirement stopped being a promise and became a gamble. At the same time, jobs were offshored and supply chains globalized in pursuit of cheaper labor. This didn't just move factories. It hollowed out wage floors across entire industries. Bargaining power collapsed. Communities lost economic anchors. The middle class shrank not because people stopped working, but because their work stopped being valued. Debt expansion accelerated the illusion. As wages stagnated, borrowing filled the gap. National debt surged past $35 trillion, while household debt exploded alongside it. The dollar's purchasing power eroded steadily. People didn't feel richer. They just felt more leveraged. Growth was sustained by credit, not income. Then came crisis consolidation. In 2008, predatory lending detonated the housing market. Millions lost homes. Banks were rescued. Assets were bought cheaply by those with capital. Home ownership declined while rents began their long climb. Wealth didn't reset. It concentrated. The pandemic repeated the pattern at a larger scale. Trillions were injected to stabilize the system, but flows favored asset holders. Equity markets surged. Housing prices jumped over 40% in some regions. Wages lagged again. The gap widened further. Finally, ultra-low interest rates turned housing into a speculative instrument. Cheap money allowed institutional buyers to accumulate property at scale. When rates rose, affordability collapsed, locking households out permanently. Each step fed the next. Wage suppression forced debt reliance. Debt masked decline. Crises transferred assets upward. Measurement hid the damage. The result is a hollowed middle. Too rich for help, too poor for stability. And when a society erases its middle class, the consequences don't remain abstract. They show up physically, on streets, in housing, in behavior. That's where the damage becomes impossible to ignore. When the middle class is stripped out of an economy, the damage doesn't stay theoretical. It becomes visible, tangible, impossible to explain away. This is the stage where the system's failures stop showing up in spreadsheets and start appearing in physical space. The most obvious signal is housing displacement. Homelessness is now at its highest level since the Great Depression, not because people stopped working, but because housing costs broke free from wages. Rents rose faster than income for years, then accelerated again. Entire income brackets were priced out at once. When shelter becomes unaffordable, instability doesn't look like chaos at first. It looks like people stretching limits, doubling up, living temporarily in places never meant to be permanent. Over time, those temporary arrangements become permanent fixtures. At the same time, a second contradiction appears: excess and scarcity existing side by side. Luxury apartments sit partially vacant while demand for affordable housing explodes. New developments advertise monthly rents of $4,000 to $6,000, priced for a buyer that no longer exists at scale. Vacancy rates rise not because housing is plentiful, but because it is mispriced. Capital chases returns instead of sheltering people, and the mismatch grows wider every year. Public space reflects the pressure. Encampments expand not because services disappeared overnight, but because the number of people unable to absorb shocks keeps growing. When even a small disruption, job loss, rent hike, medical bill, pushes households past the edge, the spillover becomes visible. Sidewalks, underpasses, parking lots, and vehicles become extensions of a housing system that no longer functions. This visibility isn't confined to housing. Consumption patterns fracture. Retail traffic weakens. Discretionary spending collapses first, followed by non-essential services. Even traditional demand anchors fail to hold. When people reduce spending not out of caution but necessity, it signals that cash flow has stopped circulating. The economy doesn't freeze dramatically. It quietly hollows out. Infrastructure strain follows. Cities face higher cleanup costs, emergency response pressures, and public safety challenges, all while tax bases weaken. The system pays more to manage symptoms while losing the revenue needed to address causes. This creates a feedback loop. Deterioration fuels flight, flight shrinks resources, and shrinking resources accelerate deterioration. There's also a psychological shift embedded in these physical signs. When people see instability normalized around them, expectations recalibrate downward. Long-term planning fades. Mobility declines. Trust in institutions erodes. People stop assuming the future will be better than the present. That mindset shift is not emotional. It's rational in an environment where effort no longer guarantees security. Crucially, these conditions are not confined to traditionally poor areas. They now appear near high-value neighborhoods, major employment centers, and expensive real estate corridors. That proximity matters. It signals that the problem isn't marginal, it's systemic. When collapse reaches places once insulated by wealth, it exposes the limits of denial. This is the point where narratives fail. You can no longer blame individuals when patterns repeat across regions, incomes, and industries. You can't call it mismanagement when the same outcomes emerge everywhere the same pressures exist. And once physical signs reach this scale, the system enters its most dangerous phase. Because visible collapse forces a choice: acknowledge reality and confront causes, or continue managing appearances while pressure builds underneath. History shows that avoidance doesn't restore stability. It delays reckoning. When collapse becomes visible, silence stops working. For years, acceptance was the system's most effective stabilizer. People were told conditions were temporary, that patience would be rewarded, that growth would eventually lift everyone. But patience only works when improvement follows. When rents rise every year, wages lag permanently, and survival requires debt, belief erodes. What's breaking now isn't optimism, it's credibility. The shift didn't begin with ideology, it began with arithmetic. When households spend 60 to 75% of income on fixed costs, explanations stop mattering. When healthcare premiums climb past $1,200 a month, when a modest apartment demands $2,500, when savings rates fall near zero, lived experience contradicts every official reassurance. People don't need charts to know something is wrong. Their accounts already told them. That contradiction is why voices multiplied. Not because people suddenly became angry, but because denial became impossible to maintain. The economy kept reporting strength while everyday life delivered weakness. Markets hit records while households hit limits. The gap between headlines and reality grew too wide to ignore. What's different now is permanence. Previous downturns carried an implied end. This one doesn't. Costs don't reset downward. Debt doesn't disappear. Housing doesn't reprice to wages. The future stopped offering relief. That realization changes behavior. People stop planning around improvement and start bracing for endurance. This is also why blame narratives stopped working. For decades, struggle was framed as personal failure. Budget better. Work harder. Learn a skill. That story collapses when people who followed every rule end up in the same position. When professionals, graduates, and full-time workers experience the same constraints, the myth dissolves. Failure is no longer individualized. It's recognized as structural. Another line was crossed when fear replaced aspiration. Financial decisions became defensive. Risk tolerance vanished. Households stopped believing effort would compound. That psychological shift matters more than any statistic. Economies don't run on money alone. They run on expectation. And expectation is now gone. Notice what hasn't happened. There hasn't been mass excess or irresponsibility. There has been restraint. Spending fell. Consumption narrowed. People adapted downward quietly before speaking up. That restraint is evidence of exhaustion, not recklessness. It shows how much pressure was absorbed before breaking. What emerges in this phase isn't chaos, it's clarity. A collective understanding that the old promises no longer apply. That the system functions, but only for those insulated from its costs. That everyone else is being asked to normalize instability as adulthood. This is why the language changed. People stopped asking when things would get better and started asking why they're like this at all. That question doesn't come from ideology. It comes from lived contradiction. And once enough people ask it, the illusion ends. Because a society can survive hardship, it cannot survive pretending that hardship is normal.